Jim is probably better. Well, let me add my thanks to the organizers, to Steve and Dan, and to all the others, some of whom I probably haven't met. I regret having missed a dinner that was generously offered. I was booked, and that was a hard invitation to turn down. I was anxious to meet you. I'm honored to be with you on this panel.
Did you stand?
I don't know if the cord will let me stand, but...
It will very soon.
Oh. High tech. Yeah. Is that better? Okay, certainly. Yeah, pleased to do it either way. I am required to offer a disclaimer, as you can imagine. These are strange clothes for me, and the disclaimer is fairly commonsensical, I suspect, and that is that the ideas that I'll express tonight are my own only. I don't speak for the Air Force or the Department of Defense. Well, after what we've heard, and this is the tip of the iceberg, one might ask, why drones? And in the Air Force, that question resonates very strongly, as it does, I think, throughout the military. Those who are purists will say, well, let's get our terminology straight first. And drones, for reasons that you'll probably understand soon, if you don't already, is not a term that most people like. They like more precision. So you hear in military circles a couple of acronyms. One is UAVs, Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, and the other one is RPA, Remotely Piloted Aircraft. And the latter is preferred in part because our legislators and others rightly worry about aircraft that are off doing things on their own, which may be a disturbing feature of our future, but it tends not to exist now. Instead, what we have is human beings, sometimes from many thousands of miles away, remotely piloting aircraft. So there are not automatic kill algorithms yet. Morality isn't programmed yet. It might be someday. And those phrases, I think, make most of us queasy because we're not sure, first of all, that there's a possibility of programming morality into fully autonomous vehicles. We're not even sure about the morality of the remote pilot. But this leads to an interesting issue. It's one that's very near and dear to everybody in my department because our job is to teach military ethics. We're not lawyers. We do have at the Air Force Academy a department of law where military lawyers work to teach the law of armed conflict. Now, some of those lawyers are experienced in air ops centers. In other words, they'll be the people at the commander's elbow when the air tasking order goes out for manned or unmanned aircraft to go on their missions. And some of those missions might be lethal, some of them might be reconnaissance, some of them might be search and rescue. Ethicists tend not to talk directly about law of armed conflict. Instead, they talk about the just war tradition. In particular, when it comes to drones, the in bello, that is to say, what happens in combat principles. And there are two major ones. One is discrimination, which says that combatants must do their utmost to distinguish between those who are legitimate targets, namely other combatants on the other side, and those who are non-combatants. We might say civilians. It's sometimes a complicated issue to figure out who's a target, who can be a target, who may morally be targeted, and who may not. And the other side is proportionality of needs. In other words, weighing the good and the ill that comes from a certain mission that's contemplated. That's one of the scary parts. This is a forward-looking principle. In other words, one has to use a crystal ball to try to figure out what the relative good and harm is going to be. And as we just heard in such eloquent anecdotes, a lot of times that calculus goes awry. Sometimes it may go awry and we have no idea. We may never find out in some of the more remote areas. Other times there may be false reports. In any case, we know that a lot of mistakes are made, that combatants die, but so do non-combatants. One of the things that vexes discussions is that when you think about those two criteria, those two principles of moral war in combat, and these principles have been developed over literally thousands of years, depending on how you date the just war tradition, certainly centuries, they attend to effects and intentions. They don't attend to needs. In other words, if there's somebody in here, and I hope there are many, who would say, we must not kill the numbers of non-combatants that we have in the past. This is General McChrystal's observation, and many others have been saying the same thing. In uniform, out of uniform, pacifist voices, just war voices, all agreeing that we have to do something. Is it possible, some will ask, that so-called drones, in this particular case really RPAs, remotely piloted aircraft, are actually better suited as means than some of the older technologies that we used to use in the very recent past? For example, for close air support, which many of these missions are, such as the one that you mentioned, where it was feared that U.S. forces on the ground might be attacked by Taliban moving forward in a couple of vehicles. In the past, that mission might have been carried out by F-16s. Or maybe there would be an A-10, a tank buster aircraft in the vicinity. If it's an F-16, the pilot has perhaps not so much as a glance, not even a glance at his target. There's intel, there's smart weapons, he knows something about coordinates, he flies over, there's a big whoosh. It's possible that film, gun camera film, will record what happened, and there'll be a debrief. Maybe not. But there won't be eyes on. So one of the things that is very problematic right now when we know that RPAs, drones, are causing problems, that we are killing non-combatants, is, do we have a better technology? One answer is just to abandon those missions. And obviously there's a lot to be said for that. I think if, throughout history, if people could push the replay button on, or just the rewind button on going to war, they would. There are a bunch of activities that we probably wouldn't have undertaken at all had we had the chance to do it over, but we don't. So there we are in the middle of combat. We have people on the ground. We know that there's going to be close air support missions. In some cases, those close air support missions will be supporting Afghan troops, for example, as does happen. What will we use? The older technology or the newer? Will we use the so-called long loiter technology of drones, of remotely piloted aircraft, or will we return to using aircraft that might be even less discriminate? It's obviously not my call. As a military ethicist, when I'm teaching cadets, I emphasize that whatever the means, the intentions and effects must correspond to the just war tradition. Now, many of you who are aware of that tradition realize that there is something called the doctrine of double effect, which some people would call the refuge of scoundrels. It's traced especially back to the 13th century and Thomas Aquinas, which suggests that sometimes you can foresee evil, such as killing non-combatants. If you don't intend it, but you foresee it, it ends up being a collateral effect of a greater good that you're trying to accomplish. Some argue that the just war tradition allows that. Obviously, that justification is used. You'll hear it when you turn on your TV, you hear press conferences. A journalist might not ask the question so explicitly, but might say, surely you knew this was a populated area. How could you undertake a mission that in fact killed non-combatants? And the answer, again, if you read it a little bit between the lines, kind of distill it, will be something like, yeah, we knew that would probably happen, but we had a target that was so important that we had to undertake it anyway. That is on the fringe for many just war thinkers. I know any number of uniformed folks who, whether they're teachers of ethics at the academy or not, who are uncomfortable, who are haunted by those kinds of events, especially if they've been involved in them directly, but also if they haven't. Is there any good that could come out of drones? Well, arguably yes, if they were used perfectly. If they were used, for example, not as lethal means, but for reconnaissance. Or, if they were lethal drones, if they were used in such a way that they were always perfectly discriminate. When I was in Afghanistan, down south, in Kabul actually, at the time I was there, There was a tragedy that took place up north in Mazar-e-Sharif. It was an area where the Germans had control, and a German colonel happened to find out that a tanker truck had stalled, and he believed that a number of Taliban were going to take that truck, and he feared that it would be used as a kind of explosive on wheels that could kill a lot of his troops and a lot of Afghan allies. So he called in an airstrike. It was not an airstrike that employed drones. It was an airstrike with traditional aircraft. What happened is that a lot of totally innocent people who were desperate for fuel, who were collecting fuel, ended up being literally incinerated. And there was speculation, as I was in another part of the country, that had there been a drone available, that might not have happened. It's an odd inversion, one that makes all of us, I think, uncomfortable. But we're talking about the means, and we know that tools can be used for good or evil. There's a lot more to say, but I think I'll close with this, that all of the issues that make us uncomfortable right now about the use of remotely piloted aircraft are going to become much more uncomfortable potentially when we're not talking about RPAs anymore, when we're truly talking about UAVs, such as autonomous vehicles. We might not even be talking onesies, twosies. We may be talking what some people are calling swarms. We might be talking about communication between swarms. Who knows how complex it could get once autonomy comes into the picture more fully. This, I think, will test our ethical character as a military and as a nation. I would like to think as a coalition of nations very severely. I hope that we'll overcome what Kelly has already alluded to, which is this threshold problem. That is to say that there might be some weapons which are just too easy to use. And if they're too easy, we'll be tempted to use them when we shouldn't. Whether war has already been joined or whether we're not in combat, but we're tempted to go there. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.